Hi, my name's Monique Woodward and this is another episode of Community Designs. Today we're in the West at the Maidstone Tennis Pavilion. Let's go have a hit. Joining me on the tennis courts is Suzannah Waldron from Searle and Waldron. Suzannah, tell us about this project.
We're here at the Maidstone Tennis Pavilion, which is a project from the Melbourne City Council. It's obviously a pavilion for the tennis courts. When we started this project, the existing pavilion was in a pretty dilapidated state. It had been abandoned for 10 years, had a lot of asbestos, a lot of graffiti, and the brief that was given to us by the council was they really wanted to make this a space for the community, have a good relationship with the tennis courts, and also kind of improve the amenities in the building. So in many ways it's a really small project, and what we've sort of focused on is how we could respond to the heritage of the project, retain the sort of qualities of the existing pavilion, and then through the new facilities and amenities add a sort of an additional, what we call a sort of a amenities pod.
So the amenities pod, I mean, this is obviously a ripper little project. It's a national award winner. Tell us about the amenities pod.
One of the things we're really interested in was the history of the site, and that's something we're quite interested in a lot of our work. So the project's quite interesting. It was originally located about 6 kilometres away in Sunshine at the Sunshine Memorial Gardens, and it was actually a single gabled pavilion, so it was about half the size that you see here. So there's this interesting history of additions and alterations and kind of relocation of this project. It got expanded in the 1950s when the tennis club had more members. It got a second gable, if you like. And so we took this opportunity in terms of putting a third gable onto the building. So expanding the sort of idea of the alteration to create a new addition. And then we've sort of integrated that with access for DDA and seating and ways of interacting with the courts as well. So the front of the pavilion, we have this kind of new deck and new seats, and they kind of tie the old and the new together. And then there's sort of angular cues, if you like, in the amenities pod. So that sort of picks up for us on the sort of ridge lines and kind of angular features that are in the existing project too.
And so talk about the materiality and how that came.
With the new amenities pod, we're really interested in using timber that would relate to the existing project, but do it in a different way. So use it both decoratively and also functionally. So we were trying to, this is a small project, do things like allow for natural ventilation. So picked up on the fretwork of the existing building, and so some of the boards have got gaps in them. We use it in terms of filtering light through the skylight that's above the toilet, and that allows for natural light to filter into the space. And then in terms of the form of the building, we use diagonal boards, so they're sort of shifted in orientation. And so there's a sort of a juxtaposition, if you like, between the new additions to the building, which are sort of natural, and then the painted kind of original building. And we kept the original minty hues, the sort of greens that were there from the 1950s. And I guess for us it was important that there was the legibility of being able to see all the additions and alterations. So the new pavilion, if you like, or the new amenities pod really adds to that reading of these kind of layers that have been added over time. This project is really one of 3 parts. So there was an existing building over on the park that was demolished to make way for a new landscaped area, which was done by the council. The courts themselves were done by 2MH, and then we were appointed to do the architecture, but they were actually 3 separate contracts. So when we started the project, the courts had already been designed but not yet built, and we were I guess faced with a sort of question about how we would deal with the relationship between the existing pavilion and the courts. There's a really close proximity. One of the things that we thought we needed to do really was make the most of the veranda space. So how that might become less of a space for just stopping, but also a space for moving through. So we developed a strategy whereby we've got both steps, ramp, and also seats that get integrated into that space and allow for access across the front of the building, but also as a spot that you can sort of sit down and watch the tennis courts. So that close proximity becomes a kind of a positive thing. And even though you're really you've got a relatively small gap between the tennis courts and the building, that becomes a kind of a really nice, intimate kind of viewing zone, and also a good sort of relationship to the interior of the club room.
And so talk to us about the interior of the bathroom pod. I mean, it's very glamorous.
It is, and I guess what we wanted to do was elevate something that could be quite a functional and straightforward thing. Yep. It was the main kind of part of the brief, was really just simply to provide a disabled toilet. But we sort of saw this as an opportunity to provide something that might be a little bit better than your average public toilet might be. Yep. So we were interested in picking up on the sort of hues of the existing building. So it uses a very minty kind of green vinyl, which wraps up the wall to form a shifting dado around the edge of the room. And then another thing we were interested in, I guess, was talking about the construction of the building. So it's timber framed and it's got timber lining, but when you go into the inside of the amenities pod, you see these layers. So at the top level, you can see sort of boards that start to get revealed. We can see the sort of stud work, and then as we come towards the bottom, we have a timber sort of lining and then the vinyl lining. So it's kind of, reading these layers of construction in the building, and hopefully sort of I guess there's a certain honesty in that, but there's also a kind of sculpturalness to the space that we were really interested in. So the sort of angular forms that you see on the outside of the building then get expressed on the interior. So you end up with almost a folded kind of aperture with a skylight above. Yep. And we sort of used green amperlight in that skylight too, to sort of pick up on those same sort of hues that are in the vinyl flooring and also in the exterior of the original heritage building too. And
it kind of feels like it has a relationship with the green tennis court. It almost feels,
of course,
as though, yeah, it's the perfect tennis bathroom.
It's interesting that you say that, because when we were doing the project, the courts were yet to be built, and so we were searching the documentation, trying to find out what colour they were going to be and hoping it was going to be green, so it worked out well.
And you've got a circular mirror in there.
Yeah.
Tennis balls.
A little bit. Just, there are actually these very small moments on the facade where you get this sort of circular holes in the fretwork, and it's just sort of picking up on another thing that was in the existing building and exaggerating it, and also, I guess, again, trying to little things where you're designing a mirror that's the right scale for a DDA toilet, but maybe does things in a slightly different way, and how it might have a relationship to the sort of diagonal boards and things that are happening around it. So it sort of cuts through them and it sort of sits over that sort of dado line.
Yeah, I mean, I know there was probably about 40 architects here for a party when it sort of recently opened, and so it seemed as though the kitchen works really well and that interior space can be really multifunctional.
Yeah, the existing pavilion was more or less in this configuration. It had a sort of an internal partition which we removed. Essentially, we kept some of the original features of the building, so there are some beautiful kind of box bench seats with have storage underneath them, and the kitchen as well. We upgraded it, but we've kept some of the original kind of. So there's a fold-down hatch that dates back to sort of when the 1950 alterations were done. The space on the interior needed more light, so we created a series of new openings towards the back of the project that face onto the laneway and let more southern light into the space. But we tried to keep the sort of front of the building as kind of, I guess, in its original condition as possible, but allowing for it to kind of open up to the deck.
I'm standing here with Mick Hassett, tennis court genius from 2MH Consulting. Mick, tell us about the design of these courts.
It was a bit of a tricky site, this one at Maidstone. We implemented our usual process where we'd try and get a north-south orientation and try and squeeze a compliant or a facility that fits the recommended minimum dimensions for Tennis Victoria's court sizes. But we had to squeeze it in between a sensitive camphor laurel tree and a clubhouse down the bottom end. So we knew there was a brief for the architects to do up the clubhouse, which was a bit of a dump when we took over the site. We had to build a solid pavement over some old onto-car courts. And that's always a challenge. The soil here was like plasticine, so it was really hard to get a good pavement up from that. So this is a 140mm thick concrete slab on a crushed rock pavement. Had to be all stabilised so that it stayed up out of the ground. We had to protect the courts with drainage, and we had to sort of step out of our normal recipe because we like to have our spoon drains on the outside of the enclosure so that the participants don't get their tennis balls wet when they sit in the bottom of the drain. So on the eastern side, we had to put that on the inside of the enclosure because we couldn't maintain it with a squeeze between the neighbour's fence and our fencing. I'm actually a horticulturalist, so I appreciate the challenge between saving trees and building an engineering structure such as this. So we had to liaise with our arborist to try and protect protect the tree with root barriers and fertilising it and mulching it. Yep. And it seems to work pretty well because the tree's healthy as today. Yep. And then we knew that the architects had a brief to try and get that integration with the courts and the building. Yep. It's an unusual fencing design there on the bottom end because the drop-down fencing is normally done on the sides to give that integration for the community and spectators with the play on the courts. Yep. But we didn't want to have that prison feel between the courts and the club rooms.
Yeah.
So we implemented the soft mesh retractable curtains instead.
Yeah, it works really well.
Yeah, it seems to function well, and I think it gets a lot of use this site.
Yeah. And so talk to us about these additional lines on the court.
Yeah, so Tennis Australia and Tennis Victoria chipped into the project and they wanted to see hot shots courts integrated. Yep. So it was a delicate balance of having the hot shots courts onto the facility, but it had to be done in a colour scheme that wasn't too loud. Yep. So the hot shots courts are normally orange or red. Yep. The greens were specifically chosen as the surface acrylic for this facility in keeping with the heritage style. You know, you see Australian Open, it's bright blue. Yeah. It just sort of wouldn't have fitted into this sort of environment. Yep. So we intentionally chose the greens and then went the what they call the blended colours. So just an off green. The kids can see where the line marking is, but it's not in your face and it's not stealing away from the full size competition courts.
And so was there much collaboration between Tennis Victoria and yourself?
We're the contracted technical advisors for Tennis Victoria. So any project that has our involvement, we always feed back with Tennis Victoria to make sure that they're aware of the design requirements and the outcomes of the project.
Mm-hmm. And so talk to us about the timing, how that all played out.
About 2014 we first got engaged, and often our first role will be do some concept plans to sort of show the functional use of the site and the space. So once that's approved, then we can go into detailed design. So we spent the first 2 years probably working through the design and council with their tender process. We helped them on the tender panel to appoint the right contractor. So there's a good couple of years went by before we saw any materialisation of the clubhouse. Yeah.
And you know, obviously people really enjoy it and play tennis here. These aren't stunt tennis players.
No, they're just generally rocked up. And, I think that's the beauty of this site because we are the contracted technical advisors for Tennis Victoria. We travel all over the state, so we see so many different tennis facilities. And this one stands out to me because it's a real genuine integration of the community. So the landscape space that council developed brings people to the site and encourages people to just pick up a tennis racket and have a hit. And that's unusual. To have the fully accessible community site like this is really one out of the box. And then I laughed for many months looking at that pavilion when it was originally here, thinking, I don't know what they're going to do with that. But it's amazing, the work that's gone into that, and to get those results is really outstanding. And I think the three components come together really well, the landscape, the courts and the clubhouse. Because
I can imagine a lot of your work is collaborative in that way.
Yeah, a lot of councils don't have the funds available to commit such a good upgrade or the landscape to go with it. So we're typically getting involved with just a court development that's driven by a tennis club and the council. So it's good to see the amount of sort of funding put into this one to do all three properly in a pretty small window of time. Jobs like this couldn't be staged, but this was pretty good and close together in the way it rolled out.
Yeah, it is pretty great that it is free to the public to use any time. They don't need to book.
Yeah, and we see sort of arguments against that sometimes in the way that it might get used, but there's absolutely no signs of any misuse or damage here. It looks like it's a real asset to the community, and I think they really appreciate it. So it can only be good for the sport of tennis. It gets people out here hitting the ball.
On the decking with Rohan King from Loaram Constructions, tell us about the build and how that played out.
Look, a bit of a different one for us in that obviously it's an existing building with a bit of history to it. So we bid the opportunity with the City of Maribyrnong, who we do a lot of work with. And obviously Nick and Suzannah being the architects involved, we're pretty keen to get involved because of that aspect. And look, it's a great result. We're really, really pleased with it. As I said, it was a bit unusual. Building of this nature and this history, it's certainly not built like the sort of stuff you'll see these days. So we had a fair few compromises to work through to straighten it up and get it healthy. But obviously with that constraint, that with the heritage considerations, we couldn't be ripping things apart and replacing them. We had to work with what we had. So, but to stand here today as we are and have a look at it, I mean, it's fantastic. And I think we've all noted that there's virtually not a mark on the building, there's not a tag on it, so I think that's probably telling us that the people who are around here really appreciate it. And they're obviously getting some benefit out of it, some pleasure, so that's fantastic.
And so talk to us about the collaboration between the architect, the tennis designer and yourself.
Look, tennis isn't my strong suit, so I won't go there. My kids would attest to that. From the collaboration, particularly with Nick and Suzannah from the architectural point of view, that's really, on a building like this, is really critical. And probably the way that they communicate on it is also important, because it's being an existing building with the history that it's got, it's been in other places and whatnot. Their knowledge of what we're going to be dealing with is limited by the level of the investigation work that they can do. They're relying on the builder, once we start getting into things, to be able to communicate well what we actually have got. And this was a bit weird and wonderful. I mean, the roof on this is a combination of, I think, recycled timber. Some of it actually are, I think, painters' planks from what we figured out, which are making up the ridge beams. So in the current building code, it's probably not going to fly. So, I mean, we've got to go back to particularly Nick on this one, who we worked a lot with, and obviously disclose, well, this is what we're dealing with. And then it's a pragmatic exercise of what can we do to get the building to perform, but in the context of its heritage, character, and what we can't just cut and shut, which we maybe would do in a 1970s building where there's not a lot of consideration. So that's really critical, and that's I think a credit to Nick and Suzannah. I mean, they were really pragmatic with us, knowing what our constraints were. It was pretty wobbly. I mean, under the floors, it was a mess. We had a family of possums that I think resided in here for a long, long time. So when the ceilings were opened up, it was pretty untidy in there. So, lots of discoveries we went through, but ultimately a really, really good result.
Did it make a difference that Nick and Suzannah are this sort of really energetic, emerging architecture practice?
Where we benchmark is on the way that we can work with people, how we can communicate, and particularly where they will provide us some insight as a builder into practical outcomes. And where we get a lot of comfort working with Nick, particularly on this one, is we actually can say to Nick, hey, listen, here's a thought that we've got, a la some of the structures on this building. We're thinking maybe go this way. And Nick will actually say, yeah, okay, interesting thought. Why would we do that? There might be commercial benefit, there might be a time benefit, there might be just a risk that we're identifying that we're thinking, if that goes the way we think it might, it's going to be a problem. That's where it's really helpful. And for my guys, my site supervisors and site managers, that makes their life a lot easier. It really does.
So what's your favourite space?
Again, I'm not an architect, so but I'm an outdoors type person. So I mean, the decking and the way that the front of this came together, particularly being mindful of what it was like when we started. I mean, this is a great spot. The bathroom, it's certainly a bit left field. There's no doubt about it. And it was such a tight old building, and it was severely out of level. I mean, when we restumped it and re-levelled it and straightened it all up, I think we picked up about 170 mil across the building as we brought it all up. And now we're, 18 months down the track since it was handed over, and I doubt if it's moved at all inside. And that's great, because it's also not a great soil around here. A lot of this soil is reclaimed. So both sides of it really, really great. And
how long did it take to build?
Look, it was a long process because of some probably unexpected complications. The client, City of Maribyrnong, I think they had to amalgamate a couple of titles here to bring the tennis courts in with this part of the building. That made it a little bit difficult to get some of the services in. So again, one of the unusual aspects of the job was we ran this almost entirely off generators. We had no site power at all. And when you combine generators with F27 hardwood, doesn't do a lot of favour to power tools. So it was quite long and protracted in that regard to get it all put together. Also, we were through the middle of winter, so you're obviously a little bit constrained with the weather. So I mean, we wrapped it all up. I think it was about an 18-week program in the end.
Yeah, nice. But it's an amazing outcome. So you should be really proud.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Again, you come back in 18 months' time, as we have, and I think the biggest thing that you pick up is just how well it's continuing to be presented. Everything's neat, tidy. I said there's not a tag on it. In the world that we live in, that's not too common these days. So I think that's sending a message that I'd say the local community must really appreciate the facility. And we saw a couple of lads here earlier on belting the tennis ball around, and if that's the standard of tennis that they're delivering, wow, that was pretty impressive as well. So no, look, a really good result, and as I said, I think it presents as well as when we handed it over.
Thanks so much for joining us for another episode of Community Designs. See you next time.